gentlemen, welcome to FritzCast 2021. We're in season 5. I've been doing this mind-numbing podcasting experiment, extravaganza, hoopla, whatever you want to call it. I've been doing it since 2015, exactly 5 years ago. And it's been a hell of a journey getting to this point. But I'm not gonna go into a long monologue rant right now, because I just wrapped up a great conversation with John Ziegler. John Ziegler is a former talk show host, current podcaster, senior columnist at Mediaite, and a host of other things for politics, filmmaker, documentarian. And I have a great deal of respect for John. I've been following him since about 2014, 2015. From the last election. This is going to be a very big, bombastic episode that's going to piss off a lot of people, I think, which I'm totally okay with, because this is how it's going to work. We talk about the events of January 6th and what happened with the Trump crowd on January 6th, storming the Capitol. We talk about those events. We talk about the last 4 years of events. And talking about those events is probably going to get people who are more democratic and progressive thinking. They're going to really love John Ziegler up until we hit the COVID point. And then we start talking about COVID, and the conversation pivots, and the audiences are going to flip-flop. The people who were pissed off in the first half, if they stuck around, are going to be ecstatic in the second half. And the people who are ecstatic in the second half, or in the first half, are going to be pissed off in the second half. It's going to be amazing. But also, 5 years of podcasting, I sat down as I started formulating the direction I was going to go this year. Because last year I opened up guests and I started having guests, and it's been a big boost. I've gotten new followers, new contacts, new hits, new likes, new everything. People are really starting to take notice and take wind of FritzCast, which I knew it would take a while to build up a podcast, and I'm not going to sit here and tell you I'm a big man on a big planet. You know, I'm not. I'm a small man, small operation, libertarian. I'm not king of the libertarians either. I'm not, but it's great to see people coming into what I'm calling the FritzCast revolution, and it got me thinking. Well, the events of January 6th, which I'm going to break down my thoughts on these last 4 years and where we're going forward, not in next week's episode, because next week I have another great guest. I have Brad Palumbo coming on the show. So third week in January is going to be the first monologue episode where I can just kind of sit down and decompress all these events at length, and that's what I'm going to do. But sitting down and thinking about moving FritzCast forward, there's a lot that I feel like I've been holding back too much. I've been worried too much about what people are going to think about how I feel about libertarian values, the pillars and the principles that make me who I am. And I've come to the conclusion that I'm not going to make everybody happy, and I don't care to make everybody happy. This is my opinion, but more importantly, it's the embodiment of who I am. And if that's the case, fuck all the rest of it, man. Literally, I can't hold back anymore. I can't sit on the sidelines anymore. I can't mull through episodes of the podcast if that's what I've been doing, which a couple of the ones towards the end there, because of COVID and because of lockdowns and a bunch of other stuff. Some of it felt like a drag, and that's not what FritzCast is. You're supposed to come here. I'm supposed to be somebody that gives you information, gives you a perspective from a libertarian standpoint. Libertarian standpoint's a broad term, point you in the direction of other great libertarian and liberty content creators, people and influencers in this movement. That's what I'm supposed to do, and we're supposed to do it in a fun manner, in a fun, zany manner. Where Brian, when I do my crappy Stewie voices, and people seem to like it. I don't know why. Because I don't know. Or when people want me to pull out Bernie Sanders and talk about Donald Trump and Medicare for all, and that's what it's supposed to be. It's supposed to be goofy, fun, lighthearted, serious when it needs to be. So there might be some directional changes coming forward. But I have a great episode today with John Ziegler. It's coming up right now. I'm not going to keep you waiting. Brad Palumbo's next week. We'll talk about what's next week later. But right now, it's time for John Ziegler. And my guest this week, ladies and gentlemen, is John Ziegler. John, welcome to FritzCast.
Thanks for having me, Fritz.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to having you here, kicking off my new year and my new season for the podcast, because I feel like the last year that we've quote unquote lived through was just I can't even. I want to be professional and not say incredibly fucked up, but that's what it was.
Agreed.
Before we dive into anything, can you just give a little introduction of yourself, a little bit of your background, and what it is that you have done and what you do now?
That might take all 45 minutes.
We'll go with
to talk.
We'll go with the condensed version.
Currently, I'm a podcaster and a column writer for Mediaite. I'm the senior columnist at Mediaite, have been for several years. And I also do documentary films. I do a podcast called the Individual One Podcast, which is about the Donald Trump presidency from a conservative perspective. I'm a lifelong conservative libertarian who has been anti-Trump, but I think from a fairly unique perspective in that I do not reflexively attack Trump at every moment. In fact, I've defended him at times. But I'm also horrified by the Democratic reaction to the COVID pandemic. And so I'm in a very small boat of maybe like a couple of people who are conservative, anti-Trump, but anti-COVID reaction, which, by the way, I believe that a lot of the COVID reaction was in direct response to Donald Trump being president. That I think COVID was seen through the prism of Donald Trump being president by a lot of people, especially liberals. So that's the very, very short version of my background.
Yes, and that's part of that. That is a big reason why I've followed you throughout. I think I started following you in 2014 or 2015. It was right before that election cycle. And I've got to say up front, one of the reasons that I've stuck with you this long is consistency. Consistency went out the window with conservative talk radio in 2016 because it was selling out to MAGA. You had to wear a red hat and pander to the audience because that's what you had to do.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that because as a former talk radio host, I mean, I was a fairly substantial talk radio host. I was a Los Angeles talk show host on KFI in the evenings, the #1 talk station in America at the time. I was at one time supposedly being groomed to take over for Rush Limbaugh, or at least to fill in for him. So I was in that world. And I think it gave me a very strong insight into what was happening before anybody else saw it. And you described it very well, which was that the inmates took over the asylum. Because the business model of talk radio broke, the hosts were no longer in control. They were following the audience instead of the audience following the hosts. And the hosts immediately realized that the audience was on the Trump train and that they better get on it or else they were going to be out of a job. And because I was out of talk radio, or I was actually not out of talk radio at the time, I was doing a weekend syndicated show, but I don't care about, well, my wife will tell you I don't care about my career, which she's not particularly happy about, but I don't really care about popularity. And so that didn't influence my thinking about Trump. And I have to say that in most respects, my view of Trump has been 100% vindicated. My number one concern of many about him was that he was going to, if he did become the nominee and become president, he was going to eventually create a liberal backlash, the likes of which we'd never seen before. And that has clearly happened. And by the way, I think we've only seen the beginning of that.
Yeah, that's that's the next bit that I was going to ask you about, because when I reached out to you to schedule this interview, we had not yet gone through the events of January 6th, which I think if we can talk a little bit about that. I enjoyed listening to your last episode of Individual One. In some ways, I think it's unfortunate that I haven't been able to hear your take on January 6th. I mean, it was in that episode lightly, but those events were unfolding at the time you were recording it. First off, how did you feel at the unfolding of those events?
Well, as you mentioned, it happened as we were taping the most recent episode of the Individual One podcast, which will continue through January, and then we'll wrap it up. And I was really physically ill, even just seeing on my phone the photographs of the assault on the Capitol. And this was even before we knew anyone had been killed or had died. And, I'm someone who I despise the liberal media, and I think that they have definitely taken advantage of this to create a narrative that fits their view of the world. And I think even Joe Biden and Kamala Harris have done the same thing. And I think it's highly unfortunate. But as far as the events that transpired, I thought it was disgusting. There's no defense of it. Everybody acted wrong. I mean, obviously the security was pathetic. I don't understand how this was allowed to happen, but let's be clear. The people that were most responsible for this are Donald Trump and his sycophants, especially in the conservative media, who were ginning up this bogus narrative regarding election fraud. And when you have people who have been told for 2 months by people that they respect, admire, and trust, including the President of the United States and lots of people in the media, that the election was stolen and that their way of life is in peril. I'm sorry, eventually, especially when you get a huge crowd together and they feel empowered by the fact that they're a huge crowd and they get told to go over to the Capitol and fight, bad things are going to happen. Now, did Donald Trump anticipate that it was going to be as bad as it was? I would like to believe not, but that doesn't matter, because he's still responsible. When you play with fire, even though you don't want the house to burn down, if the house ends up burning down, you're responsible for that. It's still arson. And Donald Trump, in my view, has always been an arsonist at heart. And I was, get back to your first question, I was physically ill, just at the whole scene. And that was even before we found out about the tragic deaths. And I am confused as to why the woman from San Diego was shot the way that she was. I'm horrified that a police officer was apparently beaten to death. I don't believe this bogus attempt to deflect that somehow Antifa was primarily responsible for this. I don't think there's any evidence of that. I've already written for Mediaite that I believe that Donald Trump should be forced to resign. As we do this podcast, there's some signs that could actually end up happening. Lisa Murkowski of Alaska has now called for that. Republican senator from Alaska, Nancy Pelosi, has announced that they are proceeding with both an impeachment inquiry as well as an attempt to invoke the 25th Amendment. To me, as we speak right now, the only thing keeping Donald Trump in office is that Mike Pence and Mitch McConnell have not yet totally bailed on him. If either one of those two people totally bail on him, he's probably going to be forced to resign. If both do, he's for sure forced to resign, or he will be removed. I have concerns about how that happens from a process perspective, but I do believe that Donald Trump should be removed from office. Of course, I felt that a long time ago. I felt that he's committed numerous offenses that should have resulted in his removal from office. I never thought that he would be. I still don't think he will be, but as we speak, those chances are inching up. I think there's I don't know, off the top of my head, 33 to 40% chance he is not president on January 20th.
Wow, there's a lot to unpack with everything that you just said there, because like you said, how people were trying to blame Antifa. I've had arguments with Trump supporters and the MAGA crowd over this over the past couple of days, because I've watched the narrative switch from that this was trying to instill an election that was being stolen to it was peaceful, it wasn't violent. It's comparisons to when Democrats or more progressive causes were at the Capitol in mass, but none of them, it's like a false equivalence type of thing. Like every time they show, and it's so blatant now when I'm seeing it on Twitter, which I know Twitter is a cesspool, but when I see it on Twitter, they're drumming up or they're digging up these old videos of like when they were protesting Kavanaugh and they were at the court doors and they were banging on them, and they're saying this is no different this time. And I'm looking I'm looking at video after video after video of an angry mob storming, barricades, pushing police back, breaking windows, and just all around other violence and looting and destruction of property. This was like my turning point, where up till now, like I've been listening to your show, I have not been a fan of Donald Trump. I've thought very dangerous things have been going on. But January 6th, when I turned on the television and I saw this, I said, wow, it really is a cult. I took too long to really solidify that in my mind, that this is just a cult and there's no talking to these people. Is this like just straight up brainwashing almost? I mean, that's what it seems like to me when I'm looking at this.
Well, good for you for, even if it might have been a little late, for acknowledging that. I mean, I've been calling the Trump fans Cult 45 since he got elected. I think I even got credit for, I don't know if I deserved it, but I think I got credit for that hashtag Cult 45. I think I've referred to his fans as a cult since the Republican primary of 2016. I mean, if anything, and my wife, who's actually a Trump fan, not in the cult, but she's a Trump fan. She actually, I think, said it best when she said she's amazed it took this long for this to happen. When you consider how much anger has been drummed up. And I think that the reason why this happened now is because there was so much emphasis on January 6th being the last gasp, the last opportunity to change this, which was always a lie. Dan Crenshaw, and I posted his video on my Twitter feed, a video of him on Fox News Channel yesterday. Dan Crenshaw, a congressman from Texas, really said it best. I mean, these people were lied to. They were lied to by members of Congress who wanted an opportunity to speak on the floor and pretend that they were fighting for Donald Trump and for election integrity, when all they were really doing, was they were playing a game. I'm reminded of the famous scene in Rocky where Apollo Creed's trainer famously says he doesn't realize this is a show. He thinks this is a fight. The Congress people thought this was a show. The Trump cult thought this was a fight. And that's what I think the biggest disparity in perception was. And again, I go back to the metaphor of playing with fire. They played with fire and they got burned. And unfortunately, it looks like at least 5 people died, either directly or indirectly, and many others were injured. And I'm sorry, there has to be some responsibility for that. Now, do I think that the left wing media is, as I've already mentioned, overplaying it in some ways, or misinterpreting it, or being overbroad in their condemnation? I mean, I think ABC News was out with a piece saying, although they changed it, that the entire Trump movement needs to be "quote unquote" cleansed. What does that mean? I mean, that sounds awfully dangerous. Twitter appears to be blocking or expunging all sorts of people from Twitter, including Sidney Powell and Michael Flynn. And I'm against that. I was horrified when Donald Trump's social media accounts were effectively deplatformed. I mean, he's the president of the United States. I mean, that's very dangerous and sets a very problematic precedent. So, unfortunately, almost any time there's a massive controversy, Fritz, nobody really rises to the occasion anymore. We're not a nation filled with great people, great men or great women. There are none, largely because the incentives are all wrong. The incentive structure is all wrong. And we've already alluded to part of it. I mean, the incentive structure of the conservative media in general and talk radio in particular is completely messed up. I mean, you mentioned Twitter. I mean, I've already referred that I don't care about popularity, but I think it's hilarious that the more right I am on a controversial subject, the more followers I lose. And people who are just make crap up in a strategic way to manipulate stupid people, their follower counts go up, oftentimes exponentially. I mean, so there's an inverse relationship to being correct or right, whether it's in a prediction or an analysis of a fact, and how popular you are on Twitter, which I think is emblematic of the entire bizarre world structure that has been created over the last couple of decades, and for which we are now paying a very, very deep price and will continue to, because I don't see how it ever gets changed or fixed.
Yeah, I was going to ask you that because as you coin yourself a conservative libertarian, I don't know if I asked who you voted for this last election, who did you vote for? Or if
I voted for the Libertarian candidate.
So you voted.
Right. And in 2016, I voted for Evan McMullin, and then in 2020, I voted for the Libertarian candidate. I had intended to vote for Joe Biden, who I guess you could say at the very, very, very beginning of the Democratic primary process, I kind of endorsed him. I said, if you want to beat Trump, he's the guy that you should nominate. And I was correct about that. But when the COVID thing hit, I could no longer, in good conscience, vote for a Democrat. And I will never vote for a Democrat the rest of my life, because in my view, the Democratic Party, partially because of COVID, partially because of Black Lives Matter, completely lost their effing minds this year, and they went after my children. You know, I believe that they now support child abuse, and because that's what most of our COVID restrictions are about: child abuse, state-sanctioned child abuse. And so when you go after my children, go fuck yourself. I can no longer even, and I have a very, very good friend, although I can no longer speak to it because I know we'll get in a huge fight, who's John Yarmuth, Democratic congressman from Louisville, who's the chairman of the House Budget Committee. We've been through thick and thin together, and I have no idea whether or not we'll ever talk again, because I'm that infuriated by the Democratic response to those issues this year.
Yeah, that is that is a very big driving point. And so you voted for the Libertarian candidate. When you cast that vote, was it pretty much in your mind, you know, I'm just protest voting, obviously?
Of course, yeah. I mean, I'm not. I'm a lot of things, but delusional is not one of them.
Well, it's funny that you mentioned that, because I had the opportunity to interview both Joe Jorgensen and her running mate Spike Cohen, and you know, great people, you know, great conversations and all that. And it was amazing, because even talking to them, they would, they would admit that they're putting on a show. They're putting on a show about how they can win, but they can't win. And so, I mean, like, at least I went to the voting booth and in good conscience, I was like, at least I didn't vote for the most fucked up thing that, is going on. But going forward, though, because you mentioned you'll never vote for a Democrat again. When I look at the party systems that are in place right now, the GOP is like kind of dead. At least it's in very, very wounded state right now, because it still has this MAGA cult with everything that's gone on, and you and I have seen this play out on the news and all that. There's people that aren't budging. There's some people that are flipping now, yes, because they have to save some sort of face on a grander scale. But it seems like the GOP is going to be fumbling around for a little bit. The Democratic Party still doesn't embrace its, progressive side. It still kind of keeps those people in check to some degree, a little bit.
I don't know if I agree with that anymore.
Possibly.
Well, let me stop you there. I mean, one of the reasons why I'm so infuriated, and I'm sure it's unfair for me to take it out on my friend John Yarmouth, but when Trump came along, there were a few of us conservatives, Republican people in the Republican Party, who had the courage and the principles to stand up and say, no, I'm not going to be part of this. I'm not going to support this. I'm not going to enable this. This is not who we are. This is dangerous. And I'm willing to make a personal sacrifice to stand on principle. Now, unfortunately, a lot of my fellow quote unquote never Trumpers turned out to be total frauds. And they flipped eventually once they realized there was no, making money in an anti-Trump conservative world, and that was disappointing. But what really bothers me about Democrats and liberals is that COVID came along with Black Lives Matter, and not one Democrat, not one major liberal commentator had the balls to stand up and say, whoa, what are we doing here? I mean, Bill Maher, if you want to call him as such, was kind of the exception that proved the rule. He put his toe in the water at the beginning of COVID on HBO and immediately got all sorts of backlash, and he stopped because he got afraid. And there's a guy who'd been canceled previously and made a comeback. And his whole mantra is, he doesn't care about anything supposedly. And so it really infuriates me that nobody on the left has been willing to stand up to what is obvious fascism and tyranny with regard to many of the COVID restrictions, especially in the blue states. Not one person has stood up. And that, as someone who stood up against Trump, that really infuriates me. It's not a perfect analogy, but I think it's closer than many people, especially on the left, would ever be willing to accept. They're two cults. The Trump thing is a cult, and the COVID thing is a cult now. And that doesn't mean, COVID's not a hoax. COVID's real, all that. But the response to it, the embrace of governmental tyranny that doesn't even fucking work. That's the part that really bothers me. I mean, if you're going to sell out everything you are as an American, it should at least be for something that works. But there's no evidence at all any of this works at all in combating COVID. And nobody on the left has stood up because they're so terrified of going up against their own cult. And so, as somebody who stood up against the Trump cult and has the scars to prove it, that really bothers me.
No, and I think that's a rightful statement, and I think it's a good way to segue away from talking about the MAGA cult and then the past 4 years of the Trump administration.
Well, let me just. I think you were going to what's the future of the Republican Party. I think. I mean, I don't know.
Well, yes.
And look, I'm as pessimistic as anybody. I think we're completely screwed as a country. But if I'm looking at this from the standpoint of the Republican Party, one of the more interesting elements of what's going to happen in the next few days is that um, I don't believe that Trump is. I only put it at the top 40% that Trump is going to be removed from office, because I think Democrats, if they get to the precipice of doing this, are going to realize this is bad for them. It's actually good for them for Trump to be hanging around and be at least somewhat viable. And so, they would actually be doing the Republican Party a favor if they made it even more difficult for Trump to remain viable than is already there. Now, who knows in the future? People have very short memories in this day and age. To me, as long as look, all the people that Twitter, I'm going to contradict myself because I don't like Twitter banning people, but I'm talking about this purely from the standpoint of what's good from the Republican Party. If Trump lost his Twitter feed, was permanently banned from Twitter, that might be the greatest thing that ever happened to the Republican Party. Because then without his Twitter feed, Trump becomes, a defanged monster. And because phone appearances on Newsmax or One American News isn't going to cut it. Because Fox News Channel is going to abandon him. His Twitter feed is really his greatest weapon. And so, but look, as long as Trump is alive, kicking, viable, and has the Twitter feed, the Republican Party has a massive problem. I don't see how they can come up with a presidential candidate who can defeat a Democrat for at least the next 12 years. I think it's 12 years. And that's and by the way, if you really want to look into the future, of course, it's, who the hell knows is what's going to happen. But in 12 years, the demographics are going to be so much more in favor of Democrats that even if the Republican Party got a good candidate, I don't see necessarily how they win, because the Electoral College, which the Democrats have been bitching and moaning about for the last 4 years, is actually very much in their favor now, especially if Georgia and Arizona are lost. I'm not sure that they are yet, but if Georgia and Arizona are lost, then there's no path for a Republican to ever win the presidency. So, I think there's a chance that in 2022, Republicans do pretty decently in the midterms. Historically, that's always the case. But that is predicated on Trump somehow being sidelined, and that's going to be difficult.
Yeah, that's a big question mark right now, because I was, at least until a couple of days ago, I was thoroughly convinced that, lost election or not, man's never going away, and he has the Republican Party in his talons, and breaking away from it's going to be extremely difficult. But like you said, it's kind of unknown to see what's going to come from it. It'll be interesting to say the least. But more to a point that you were bringing up, now it's completely in Democratic control for at least the next 2 years.
Right, and it may be for much more than 2 years, because the Senate map is not particularly good for Republicans in 2 years. A lot of it depends on what Democrats do. In theory, with Trump gone and the COVID thing, you would think that there would be a major backlash against Democrats in 2022, but the media is so on the Democratic side. I think that there's a very good chance that the narrative is going to be that Joe Biden, and the Democrats fixed COVID, and got us through most of the pandemic, and that America's on the rebound, and that narrative is probably going to hold with a lot of people, because the conservative media, which has been very confused on COVID from the beginning, largely because of their loyalty to Trump, and he was confused, so they became confused. It doesn't have enough influence to impact the majority of Americans, which is why people don't want to, on the right, don't want to admit this, but ever since Rush Limbaugh went national and Fox News Channel became a network, Republicans have only won the popular vote, I believe, one presidential election. So, and I don't think that's necessarily a coincidence. It's not necessarily 100% correlated, but anyway, the point of this is that it's all going to be about Trump, and the problem Republicans are going to have is that without the Trump cult, Republicans can't even be competitive. And so how do you keep the Trump cult engaged without Trump? Because as long as you have Trump, you can't reach the suburbs. The suburbs are gone, and suburban moms are gone. As long as Trump is the brand of the Republican Party, so it's a catch-22.
Yeah, absolutely, it is. Going into COVID, though, especially with what you said, the media favors the Democrats here, and this is what's kind of asinine to me and infuriating to me, because we've watched this narrative go from, we're all in this together and we got to lock down and we've got to, close down businesses. This is what we have to do for each other. But then BLM comes into play. They're allowed to go out and protest, but you're not allowed to go out and collect a paycheck at your job. Into the mask wearing, the brilliant, I forget when you released the video of it, but I believe you were on your county's floor when you went out on a rant about the mask mandates and the doctor that originally was against masks and then for masks.
Right.
How has this COVID thing been so heavily inconsistent since the get-go?
Well, here's my view of what happened with the COVID narrative, which is substantially different than the mainstream news media's narrative. But if I have an expertise, Fritz, I believe it's in deconstructing media narratives, because I've seen a lot of false ones. And what I believe happened here was that there was a panic. That there was a panic in March based upon some understandable concerns about how bad this was going to be, some misinformation about what was happening in Italy and how deadly COVID virus really was. And once that domino effect started to hit America and people started canceling, major events, and then Gavin Newsom, I believe that Gavin Newsom, governor here in California, made the most substantial decision and the dumbest decision of my lifetime, certainly of any governor. And that is he shut down the entire state in the late March of last year. And he did that saying that we would have 25 million cases of COVID in the next 8 weeks. He said that after this was based upon his shutting the state down. So it's not as if he was saying, well, this will happen if we don't shut the state down. He said, I'm shutting the state down because this is going to happen. By the way, his math was totally wrong on the percentage of people in the state. I don't even know where he got his numbers from. He asked President Trump for an emergency medical ship that never even got used to come to the shores of California. And so he shuts the state down on a lie, on a panic. And once he does that, it's over. It's all over, because California, being the largest, richest state and being a very blue state, now every blue state governor not only has cover to do the same, they have to do the same. And so New York follows, and Pennsylvania and Michigan and Wisconsin, and even some more purplish and reddish states are eventually forced to, because this becomes the narrative that, oh my God, this thing is the worst thing we've ever faced. Shutting down will help stop it. And so, in my view, those two things are false. Those are two false premises. That this is the worst thing that's ever happened. I mean, it's terrible, it's horrible, but it is, in my view of the data, it is nowhere near. Let's even pretend lockdowns worked. It looks like, and the numbers aren't all in yet, it looks like the United States of America is going to have about 12 to 13% more deaths in 2020 than was expected. And by the way, for some reason, we were expected to have more deaths than we've recently had in 2020. No one's been able to explain to me why that is, but okay. Less deaths. So that actually exacerbates the excess death number. But let's just pretend that the CDC knew what they were doing and that they thought we were going to have less deaths in 2020. We end up with 12 to 13% more. We don't know how many of those, and we're never going to know because the media won't be honest, how many of those were lockdown deaths. But you got to believe that with increase in suicides and drug abuse and just the general stress of unemployment and the lockdowns and the radical change in life, that's got to be a portion of that 12 to 13% of excess deaths. So what we're talking about here is what I would call a situation that sucks. It's terrible. It's bad. It is not anything close to a catastrophe that would warrant the destruction of your entire way of life, even if doing that worked. And that's where we get to the second part of the false narrative. There's no evidence it works. None. There is literally, I've been searching for it for 10 months. I can find no evidence that certainly masks don't work. And I found no evidence that there's any correlation between the states that lock down the hardest and them doing better than states like Florida or Georgia. I mean, how the hell is, I know the media hates Florida because they're basically the Sweden of the United States. But when you look at the statistics from Florida, how could they not be far worse than California or New York or Pennsylvania or Michigan, when in fact, in some ways, they're better? How is that possible? How can Disney World be open in Florida with no problems and Disneyland here in Los Angeles is closed? Totally. How can that be? And no one asked any questions about that. And so if you're going to give up your entire way of life, and people say to me, oh, but John, the whole world did this. Well, that's not actually true. I mean, most of the world did. Certainly most of the Western world did. But not all the world. But okay, fine. Most of the world panicked and shut everything down. I'm against groupthink inherently. I think groupthink is one of the most dangerous things humans engage in. And it's almost always wrong. But okay, fine. But here's the big difference that no one wants to talk about. And I wrote a column for Mediaite at the end of 2020 about this, where I make the argument that the essence of America was killed. And the media enabled that murder in 2020 because this was our brand. This is who we are. Freedom and liberty, personal responsibility. This is the country you come to from all over the world if you want to be free from government oppression. This is like, not to make light of it, this is like if McDonald's stopped selling hamburgers and French fries. What are they then? I mean, if we're not in favor of freedom and liberty, then what the fuck are we? That's who we are. That's what made us. And so this idea that somehow, everyone else did it, so we had to do it too. I just don't buy that. I don't believe. And it's not justified in the data. And what really drives me crazy is somehow people like me get called anti-science. That's ridiculous. I mean, I believe the science is on my side. I'm totally about science. I'm totally about the data. If there was data, I have zero self-interest, zero, in believing that the suffering that my kids have gone through for the last 10 months has been for nothing. I have zero self-interest in that. I would love for there to be some evidence that this wasn't for nothing, but there is none, because it was for nothing. And it ain't going away, by the way. That's the other thing. It's very clear when you give this kind of power to bureaucrats and many of them unelected health directors who don't have a freaking clue about life or even health or science, and these governors from especially blue states or the wussy ones from red states like Mike DeWine in Ohio. I mean, so they're not going to give this power up. They're getting sexually aroused by this, so it's never going away. Now, I'm still somewhat hopeful that eventually it'll get there'll be some let up, but there's been no evidence whatsoever that the American people are willing to push back against this in most of the country. And what was really depressing about the Georgia Senate results, and I'm sure most of the people there didn't think about it in this way, but you got a state that was the first large state to get their freedoms back, and what do? They end up voting 2 senators that are going to go to Washington, D.C. and vote for tyranny for the whole country. How the hell does that make any sense? If we were going to be able to fight back against this, that wouldn't have happened. And so I'm incredibly despondent about what the likely scenario here is about where we're going to go from here when it comes to COVID and getting our freedoms back.
Yeah, and that was going to be the big finale question. Where do we go from here, John? Are we just in for the ride and there's pretty much nothing we can do? We're going to have to go through whatever gets thrown our way?
Look, people think I'm a pessimist. I actually sometimes believe I'm a delusional optimist because I'm always looking for the hope, the hopeful scenario in anything. I don't see a scenario here. I mean, they've already told us the vaccine isn't going to change anything. I mean, so what else is there then? I mean, the vaccine, if it's anything close to what it's been advertised as, 95% effective. I mean, that's a miracle. Nobody thought we'd ever get a vaccine in less than a year. 95% effective. That is beyond the wildest dreams of anybody in the scientific realm. And so we get this miracle, and that to me is the ultimate tell that they're never going to let us go back because they're already diminishing it. And the distribution of it, for whatever reason, has been nonsensical and pathetic. And I don't know if it's political or, well, I don't know.
Totally fumbled.
Well, I mean, I'm a big believer in human incompetence, so that's probably part of it. But I mean, my God, other than that, Mrs. Lincoln, how was the play? I mean, if the vaccine isn't enough to get us back to normalcy, then nothing will ever, because you're never going to, and the idea that somehow we need 80% of the public to be vaccinated is asinine. It's beyond asinine. I mean, I thought, the big lie of 2 weeks to flatten the curve was about making sure our hospitals are not overwhelmed. Well, in order to ensure that, you only need a fairly small percentage of the population to be vaccinated. I don't know what that is, but it ain't 80%. And it's interesting that they, Fauci and others are picking the 80% number because they know that number is not possible, because at least 30 to 40% of the public is highly skeptical of vaccinations. And frankly, my wife is a good example of this. She's 47 and in great health. She would never take the vaccine unless 100% forced to. She doesn't need to. She's not at any major risk from COVID. And I mean, so the idea that everybody should be treated the same here is just insane. So I don't see the only sliver of hope I can provide. And this was part of why, and I even told my 8-year-old daughter this, because she was believing that Donald Trump was the key to opening Disneyland.
Oh yeah,
that was her view, and I tried to explain to her that no, no, if Donald Trump had won, Disneyland would never be reopened, and California would never be reopened because for a lot of reasons, but one of which is that in order to get America back to normal, you need at least, I don't know what it is, at least 80 to 90% of the population to be okay with that. Well, with 52 to 55% of the population distrusting every single thing Donald Trump says, he had no authority to declare this thing over. None. In fact, if he declared it over, 52% of the population would say, well, clearly it's not over.
Yep.
So the one sliver here is that Joe Biden does have the moral authority to end this. Because if he said it's over, congratulations, America, let's celebrate, almost all liberals would say, hey, we won, we did it. And even though conservatives would be hesitant in giving him the credit, in my view, most conservatives would be like, fuck yeah, I don't give a shit who gets the credit. I just want to be done with this. And so that's the only path. But unfortunately, I believe Biden is completely out to lunch on what COVID's about. I don't think he has any clue about the reality of COVID from a data perspective or a scientific perspective. And so, it's not much hope, but at least that exists. That if Joe Biden were to declare that America has won a victory, then I think most of this would end pretty quickly. But that's what it's going to take.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And on that note, what I wanted to close out on is I know there's a couple of weeks and a couple episodes of Individual One left, and then it'll be closed out. What are your plans moving forward from now? Are you going to open up another podcast? Are you going to focus on any particular thing, or is that still up in the air for you?
Well, during 2020, during most of the pandemic, I was taping a documentary podcast on a completely different subject, which is on the so-called Penn State Joe Paterno Jerry Sandusky scandal from 2011, which is coming up on its 10th anniversary. And myself and a television TV sports personality and I co-hosted, which is really a remarkable. I mean, there's never been a documentary podcast like it, I can assure you. I don't know how it's going to be received, how it's going to get out there. I know a lot of resources have been put into it. I know I poured, 9 years of my life into this, but that'll be coming out fairly soon. And it will, for people who care about the truth, it will be extraordinary because it's the most amazing story that's never been told. So while the work on that has been mostly done, that'll be coming out, as I said, sometime in early 2021. There's some talk of maybe me and that co-host doing a sports news related podcast in light of just how incredibly woke and liberal the sports news world has become, kind of as a reaction to that. I don't know whether or not that'll actually happen. Politically, I mean, I'll keep writing my columns for Mediaite, I presume, and obviously I'm very active on Twitter. But the politics is kind of losing its interest for me because I don't really see any purpose for what I'm doing. I'm not part of any group. I mean, I'm part of a party. I'm not even part of a club.
Yeah.
I mean, there's nobody in my category, and I have very little, if any, influence over anything. And I guess I'm a golfer, and if golf ever became a game where there was no correlation between a good shot being rewarded and a bad shot being punished, I would quit the game. Well, that's kind of where we are with politics. We're very close to that, where none of it makes any sense. And I 100% predicted both the general election as well as the Georgia runoff elections. I got it down to the exact electoral college count on the presidential election. And so, maybe that's the right way for me to go out on politics. I don't know, but I just don't. I don't really see. Even though I believe I'm incredibly well versed and I have a unique experience that allows me to see things other people don't see. I just don't know that there's any market for me. I think I'm a square peg in a round hole world.
Well, hey, man, I can respect it. I can absolutely respect it. Before I let you go, John, any social media, any websites, any shout outs you want to plug? This is your time to do it, man. Go ahead.
Well, just follow me on Twitter at Zigman Freud. That's Zigman Freud. I'm also on Facebook and freespeechbroadcasting.com. You can check out the various podcasts that I have done.
All right, John. Well, hey, thank you for your time, for coming on, and for tackling through these subjects, man. I'm really appreciative that you would come on.
Thanks, Fritz.
All right, guys, that was it. That was the episode. John Ziegler on FritzCast. That was amazing opportunity to sit down with him. For a guy that I've listened to for so long, interacted with on Twitter for so long. At the end of the day, might I agree with him on everything? No, and you shouldn't agree with 100% with everybody on anybody with anything. Probably shouldn't, especially if they're somebody that you're looking to for, advice or somebody that you trust, at least in analyzing events and things of that nature. But still, it was an amazing opportunity. I'm very, very thankful that John was willing to come on the show and talk to me. And I think we put out a pretty great episode that probably pissed off a lot of people, but that's neither here nor there. Next week, guys, is going to be Brad Palumbo. I'm interviewing him Thursday night, so that episode will probably be going up Friday of next week. The third week will be the first monologue episode of 2021 and the new direction of FritzCast and the events of the last 4 years and what happened at the Capitol and all that crap. It'll be a good fleshed out monologue episode, and you'll love it. And then closing out January, my good friend Tim McMaster, who is running as a libertarian in Pennsylvania for the Conewago Board of Supervisors, I believe, he's going to come on the show, and me and him are going to have at it because we've been wanting to have an episode for a very, very long time. And it's not just going to focus on his campaign. I'm sure it's going to focus on a plethora of other topics that have to do with libertarianism, Libertarian Party, liberty in general. So that's what's coming up on FritzCast. You can follow me, guys, if you're brand new here. Follow me on Twitter at FritzQS. FritzCast, Facebook.com/TheFritzCast. And you can find FritzCast on Instagram, YouTube, because you're watching it on YouTube right now. Apple Podcasts, Spotify, the whole 9 yards. And the one thing that I ask of you, dear listener, dear watcher, dear viewer, is to share it. Like it, share it, subscribe to it, put it out there, and give me feedback so that I can keep going on in a course that makes sense and is good for the liberty movement. It helps influence. If we can tap even one mind, that's all I got to do. That's all I got to do, and that's all I want to do. So with that being said, remember, I love you guys, and I'll see you guys next week with Brad Palumbo.